I'd like to introduce our facilitator for today, Colleen Mousseau. And so Colleen is a registered psychotherapist with a master's degree in counseling psychology. Her practice specializes in supporting children, youth, and families living with long-term illness, grief, trauma, and autism spectrum disorder. She's trained in cognitive behavior therapy, art therapy, play therapy, and EMDR. She has over 20 years of experience working within children's mental health agencies across Southern Ontario and currently holds a couple of roles, including clinical director at Andrea Warnick Consulting, as well as program leader in Wellspring's Family Counseling Program. So I think with that being said, I'm very excited to pass it over to Colleen for our talk today.
Thank you, Anita. I'm really thrilled to be part of the Be Well series and speaking on today's topic, which is going to be focused on initial conversations and ongoing conversations with caregivers. And by that, I mean people who are supporting children, including parents, family members, friends, educators, and healthcare providers. And I'm hoping to be able to help guide those conversations that we can and we should be having with young people when somebody in the family has cancer. I also need to credit a good amount of the content from this presentation to a dear colleague and friend of mine, Andrea Warnick, who has developed a ton of education and resources on this topic and provides an even deeper dive into more specific options to support around terminal illness and end of life and grief. And I'm going to link to some of those resources as well. As Vanitha was mentioning, I've been working in this field supporting families through a variety of challenges that they faced for over the last 20 years. And the last 10 of those years, the majority of my practice has been focused around supporting families in oncological care. And much of what I'm going to talk about today has been learned firsthand. And I'll try my best to make it applicable to a wide age range, but please speak up. Ask questions if you'd like something a little bit more age-specific or person-specific for the person that you're thinking about supporting as we're talking today. I also want to say this feels like a bit of a different format for me. I'm very used to being in classrooms or teaching where I actually get to see the people in attendance. And so today I'm talking to my screen, but hopeful that all those in attendance or those that are picking up the recordings are in a comfortable place. Maybe you're enjoying your lunch or having a tea or a coffee, and that you can go back and revisit any of the things that we talk about today or that I talk about today at your pace or at a pace that's going to be helpful for you. So my hope for today is that I'm able to address some of what we know to be the best practices in supporting children and youth when a parent or a grandparent has cancer. And it doesn't mean that we're exclusive to only parents or grandparents. It might be a neighbor, it might be a teacher, it might be a friend. Please make sure you can apply this to whoever it is that you're thinking about and in supporting a young person. I think it's also important that we're going to be talking about maybe what not to say or some of the not so helpful things to say to a child when somebody in the family is experiencing a cancer diagnosis. I also want to make sure that you leave today with some practical tips and strategies for preparing and including children throughout the family member's cancer diagnosis. And that you'll also have at your fingertips some literature and some organizations that you can turn to, as well as some web resources that have been designed specifically for supporting children around these conversations. So as Vanitha was saying, the slides from today, the presentation from today is going to be available online through the self-paced webinar portal at Wellspring. And then I'm also going to turn your attention to Andrea Warnick Consulting, where there are a number of webinars as well that are quite topic specific, including the topic that we're talking about today, but as well as if you're looking for something a little bit more fulsome, if you're talking about long-term terminal illness or grief and inclusion of children around those sorts of things as well. So the first thing I want to talk about is sort of what gets in the way, that often when I'm meeting with parents or caregivers, there's a great deal of hesitation around including kids in these conversations. I think initially there's a bit of a cultural backdrop to that, in that we have learned that we just don't talk about some of the hard things, and that our job as parents or as caregivers tends to be to make sure that kids have as normal and as happy of a life as possible. And then something like cancer comes along. And so there tends to be a lot of hesitation. So I want to normalize that. However, even though there's that hesitation, I think there's a lot of benefit to making sure that we are having open and honest conversations about something as big as cancer in the family. But some of the reasons that I've heard from caregivers as to why they might not want to start those conversations is because they're afraid of saying the wrong thing. And to be honest, there aren't a whole lot of guidebooks or even parenting books that will say, this is how you parent. These are the good things you can do to help build strong, resilient, healthy children. They often don't cover, and when a parent has cancer. So we're not really sure what to say. So we're afraid of saying the wrong things, so we might not say anything at all. We might also be afraid of taking away hope or increasing any amount of anxiety or fear in that child. What we know to be true, though, is actually that when we can have these open and honest conversations with kids, we can provide them the opportunity to be able to feel a lot more comfortable with what's going on. I think the other thing that often gets in the way is that we're not sure how a child is going to react, but what we don't want is for them to react with fear or to react with an increase in anxiety. But what we know to be true is that kids do a really good job of integrating some really hard information into their normal life, as long as we're able to reassure them that the information that they have is the accurate information. I think innately as adults, we have this built-in desire to protect, or this instinct to protect kids, which can sometimes mean it's counterintuitive to bring up hard things that are happening in their world or in the world in general. But I challenge that in saying that I also think it's really important for young people to feel like they can trust the people in their lives, the adults in their lives, that no matter how hard things get, they will receive honest and accurate information. And being able to establish that and be able to reassure that no matter how hard things are, I'm going to be honest with you and I'm going to talk to you about what we know is going on, can do wonders for reassuring that trusting relationship throughout a child's lifetime. And I think the last thing is that we also expect that maybe somebody else is more qualified to do this work. And that speaks to within the healthcare profession, a number of people will assume that there's somebody out there who is specialized in talking to kids about these things. And while, there are people like me that have roles where that is my job and that is part of my job, we also know that if you are a grown-up in a child's life, so if you are a parent, if you are a grandparent, if you are a teacher, if you are a close family friend, you are in that role, and the child will be looking to you and will really benefit from having accurate information come from you. Some of the common myths and misconceptions that I think also get in the way of us being able to start these conversations is assuming that, well, if the child isn't bringing it up, then maybe we shouldn't either. But what we know is that when there's something like cancer in the family, and maybe it isn't being brought up, or maybe it isn't being talked about yet, kids know a lot more than we think they do. And it can create a lot of anxiety in them if they think maybe nobody's talking to me about it because it's something that I'm doing wrong, or I'm just meant to have all these answers and I shouldn't bother my parents, or I shouldn't bother the adults in my life with the questions that I have. And so relying on a child to bring up something or start these conversations is actually asking them to take on quite a bit of responsibility. There's another myth or misconception that we would assume that, well, instead of saying the wrong thing, maybe I should just say nothing at all because I don't want to say the wrong thing. You know, I say the wrong thing all the time to my own child, but also in session. And I think kids are actually quite forgiving. When you realize you've said something, they do a pretty good job of that reality check when they tell you what they think they heard, or they let you know what they heard because of what you said. I will often say, okay, wait, can I try that again? Or I might not have meant that what I said there. Let's try that again. I think there's always room for correction. So don't let that fear get in the way of your ability to have some of these difficult conversations. Again, that instinct to protect, that we need to protect children from some of the hard things going on. In reality, I think what we need to do is provide them with honest information and support their understanding and bear witness to what their reactions are and create supportive and safe environments for them to be able to handle these things. A long-standing idea is that children should not be at the bedside, and that would include being in hospitals or hospice or even inclusion in funerals and that sort of thing. But we're really challenging that. And if we look historically at the bigger picture of things, there was a period of time where children were around illness quite a bit more than they are now. Medicine has come a really long way. And so we've really been able to sanitize things in a way that children don't have to experience a lot of illness in their life in current day. That said, when we look back in history, children did an amazing job of being present when even their siblings would get something like a flu or an illness and be seriously sick from that. But they show us that they're capable of being around difficult circumstances and still being okay. And so I want to make sure today that we're also able to talk about ways that you can include children, knowing that there might be more time spent needing to rest or more time spent in hospital. And the last thing I think to address is this fear or this worry that, if we bring this up, this means that children are going to talk about it or they're going to think about it all the time. I think what we know to be true is that maybe they are, but that's probably going to happen whether or not we're talking about it or not. And so what we're doing by opening the conversation is saying, if you're thinking about it, then let's think about it together. Let's worry about it together. Let's wonder about it together, instead of giving the message that you need to do this in isolation or this is something that you need to manage on your own. So it's an invitation to say, sit with me and we can talk about that, or we can answer questions, or I can bring those questions forward to people who do have those answers. I think the other thing that we know to be true for children is that, unlike adults who might have something like this on their mind, running in the background all the time, we see children to kind of jump in and out of thinking and feeling something one minute with, a great big reaction, and then they go back to being a child and having fun and playing once again. So they do a good job of regulating in the ways that they can really benefit from. So I'm going to talk a little bit about grief in the reaction that we have to a cancer diagnosis. And that certainly doesn't have to include only when cancer is as a terminal illness. If we think about grief as being all the different thoughts and feelings that we have in experience to a big change in our life, this certainly is one of those experiences that inevitably brings about a lot of changes. So whether that's a change in, mom isn't going to work anymore, or dad isn't able to bring me to and from school or pick me up from soccer practice. Those changes can manifest into a whole bunch of different feelings. And that doesn't mean that there's something wrong, but it does mean that it's a real, and it can be a healthy reaction, or very normal reaction that we all have, including children. So what does that grief look like when we're thinking about children and youth? I often find that specifically for children, we don't necessarily have the language to talk about it when we're younger. We will see it manifest in a physical way. So in tummy aches and headaches, we might see a shift or change in sleep patterns. So harder time falling asleep, staying asleep, early waking, or a need for more sleep. Irritability, again, I think that's relatable even on an adult level. So levels of patience might be lower than usual. Hyperactivity, I think we see this a lot with kids, an increase in silliness, an increased need for physical outlets, an increase in anger. Again, I think that's relatable on an adult level in response to a cancer diagnosis. With children, we may not actually see it targeted at, like, or if it's specifically being said that, like, I'm angry about cancer. What you might see is the anger coming out in other ways, at other siblings, at their friends. So we know that to be quite normal in terms of their reaction. And what we want to do is be able to give them opportunities to express that, not telling them that they're not allowed to be angry, but do that in a way that's not hurting themselves or somebody else. We might see a shift in their academic performance. So important that we're looping educators in, teachers in, to know what's going on and why that might be expected. It's not a sign that there's anything wrong with their capability or their ability to be able to achieve, but there is going to be likely a harder time focusing or being able to stay on task and that sort of thing. Repetitive asking of questions. Now, I bring this one up because I think it's important. Often after families have had, the talk or the talks about cancer, kids will go away, and it takes them some processing. So they'll go away and they'll come back and they'll ask the same questions over and over again. And sometimes caregivers will say, I don't think I explained it properly, because they keep asking these questions. What we know to be true for how children integrate new information is that they will benefit from the repetition. So really all they're doing in the repetitive question asking is getting a lot of reassurance from having that same answer. So don't change your answer unless you really think you've missed the mark, but give them the same response. And with that, they will have a lot of reassurance in knowing, okay, that answer is still the same, or okay, that's what I thought, but it's reassuring for them to hear it over and over again. So sometimes there will be an increase in a feeling of fear or loss of confidence in their ability to do things, an increased need for affection, so more time spent snuggling, more time with the reassurance, a regression. So if a child who has been successfully toileting, you might see that they go back to having more accidents, that sort of thing, regression in sleep, regression in language. Those would all be expected. And difficulty concentrating. So maybe having a harder time focusing on tasks that had come a bit more easy before. And again, we see that particularly in the classroom. So I like this quote. It comes from Julie Stokes. Winston's Wish is an organization in the UK, and they've developed a ton of resources. I linked to this at the end of the presentation. And she describes the difference between adult grief and children grief by saying, for adults, grief is like wading through this enormous river, whereas for children, it's puddle jumping. But when they're in that river, or when they're in that puddle, it's no different to the river. So just kind of what I was saying, where children do a good job of regulating, so they're bouncing between sitting in the really, really hard moments, but then they're able to bounce back out and enjoy themselves and find joy in life. So just a couple of things to think about when we are thinking about, well, what to say or how to have these conversations about cancer with kids. Things that I encourage to use are the accurate terminology. So using words like cancer, like chemotherapy, like radiation, like surgery, if those are relevant. And I'm going to walk you through how I would have that conversation and how I'd explain each of those things to a child. We do try to avoid terms like sick, because it's not quite the same thing as when we get sick with a cold or a flu. Not feeling good, again, most people at some point are not feeling good. That's not the same thing as having cancer. That doesn't mean don't say it. I think there's a natural, when we have side effects to chemotherapy, we're not feeling good afterwards. And it's fair for a child to hear that and to understand that and appreciate that. But the conversation needs to go beyond saying not feeling good. Terms like make all better or not going to get better. Again, there's nothing wrong with using those terms, but as a standalone, that's not going to provide enough information for a child to really know what's going on. And so I think there is a great deal of hesitation or uncertainty that we have as soon as somebody hears cancer. We're aware that there could be a variety of outcomes. And so we don't want to promise that, the medicine that mommy is taking is going to make her all better. Well, we don't know that for sure. Nobody knows that for sure. So we really want to stick to what's being honest in that moment. Mommy is taking chemotherapy. It's a special type of medicine to stop those cancer cells from growing as quickly as they want to. So again, I'm going to walk you through an example of how we might have that conversation in a way that's going to be understandable by young people. So where to get started? Think about maybe the place and the time that's going to be able to offer the least amount of distractions or disturbances. I've had some families kind of float the idea, well, maybe we should go to their favorite restaurant. I would caution against that in that, we can't ensure that the waiter's not going to come by at the same time. Maybe do that after you've had the conversation as a nice activity to do with the family, and as a reminder that we can still do fun and enjoyable things. But in the moment that you want to have that conversation, think about the things that you can control to make sure that there aren't screens on, that there aren't other people that are going to be interrupting your ability to talk about what you want to, and also the child's ability to ask questions or follow up. So choose their safe place, their comfortable space. A lot of the times that happens all snuggled up in the bed or on the couch in the living room. And again, you're thinking about how a child might be regulating when they have had too much of the conversation. You're following their cue. That might mean that they jump back to playing with their toys. Getting on the level of the child, and that means both with the language that you're using, so knowing that it's going to be understandable to them, but also physically, that this isn't a conversation where you're standing up above them and they're sitting below you. It would be kind of an intimidating place to try to facilitate a conversation like this. And starting where you're just being curious with what do you know about what's going on right now. I think that we often underestimate what kids already know. They have likely already noticed mom and dad having quiet conversations or mentioning the word cancer, or have seen text messages coming in on phones or emails coming in, or have seen literature that's come home from the hospital. Even though they're not talking about it, I think parents are often surprised to learn the kids already know a little bit. And even if they don't know about your specific situation, they do know a little bit about cancer. I think it's in the kindergarten curriculum that they start talking about Terry Fox. And so a lot of kids, when you ask them, what do you know about cancer? They will say, oh, it's a pretty serious illness. And Terry Fox had it and he lost his leg. Okay, well, does everybody who has cancer lose their leg? Well, no. Okay, and you're able to kind of build on what they already know. So when again, we're talking with kids, I like to make things as physical and visual as possible because those are things that they can relate to. I use a pop-up body book. It's been probably one of the best investments in my therapeutic tools. Kids love to look through it and ask questions about all of the things that are happening underneath the skin. So they can look at muscles, they can look at bones, they can look at the circulatory system. There are some really great options out there, puzzles for kids to take apart and put back together. And those can be really nice ways of kind of deflecting the conversation without distracting from it, so that kids have something to look at while you're talking, but also physically able to do some things without it feeling like a really intense, like eye-to-eye conversation. There are also some really great visual options if you didn't want to have to go out and buy anything online. And I'm going to, again, link to some of those resources at the end of the presentation that we can that you can have at your fingertips to support the conversation as well. So like I said before, naming cancer. So talking specifically about, what is cancer and what do we know about it? What do you know about cancer so far? What would you, how would you answer this question? Or what have you heard? What have you seen? Are there maybe symptoms of the person's cancer or their treatment that they've noticed so far? Those are really important questions to ask because you're going to want to know that what have they heard so far, that they're not hanging on to anything or any misconceptions. And I think until these things are being talked about, we know kids to be fairly, my term is egocentric, in that they are often feeling like the center of problems in the world. And what we don't want is kids to feel like this is something that they have caused, or this is something they have contributed to, or this is something that they are meant to solve or make better. Okay, so as you're asking those questions, just keeping those things in the back of your mind, that you're able to help them shift their responsibility away from that. And you're also going to move your conversation to also include things like, what are they going to notice as maybe treatments are progressed? What are some of the things they're going to see? A really common question that parents have is around hair loss, and certainly anxiety that the parents may have for themselves, but also for kids. So how are we going to explain that in a way that they know that that's actually a sign that the treatments are doing what we want them to do, which is to stop the growth of fast-growing cells. And they may want to be included in some of knowing that that's what's happening, or knowing if we're looking at things like headscarves or wigs, maybe kids want to be a part of that. Maybe they have some input around, what does mom wear when she comes to pick me up from school? Those kinds of things are really like, it's not just one conversation, but an evolving conversation as time goes on. And it's also okay to name the unknown. It's also okay to say that, at this point, the doctors aren't really sure how I'm going to respond to treatment. But I will tell you, as I continue to get results, and they're going to keep a really close eye on what's happening in my body or how I'm responding, or they do some imaging. And what we mean by that is I go into a machine and they take a look at the cells in my body, and they try to determine, how are the cancer cells? Are they getting smaller? Are they getting bigger? Do you want to continue to know that information as I get it? Most of the time, the answer that I get from kids is yes. So I like to think about it this way, in that it's the responsibility of adults to take the lead in opening the conversation about cancer, and then let the child or youth take the lead in how much information they want about the situation. So it looks like saying, this is what's going on, or this is what we know to be going on. How much more information do you want? We don't want to give them too much information or overwhelm them all at once, but letting them know that I have information that I would value being able to share with you. And I want you to let me know how much or how little you want, or when you want that. So it does look like a lot of conversations over time. So just some suggestions for how you might get those conversations started. Saying something like, I'm wondering if you could tell me what you understand and what's happening with mommy. Or how would you explain to someone who's not in the family what's happening with daddy? You get a lot of information simply by asking those questions. Maybe it's an I don't know. And then that's a great place to build from and say, well, if anybody asked, these are some of the things that we might say, or giving them some of the language that they could use to talk about their experience with the other people in their life. I think it's also important to be able to name who are the people outside of the family that you might consider having some of these conversations with. For some families, it's absolutely important that this be kept private. But that doesn't mean that we can't name people within the family or support people outside of the family who are capable of having these conversations privately as well. It's also important that we're exploring if the child or youth has overheard anything that they don't really understand. So again, opening that opportunity to say, I'm just wondering if there's anything that doesn't quite make sense to you. When we've had this conversation about cancer and what it is and how it's affecting and some of the things you've seen, is any of this not quite adding up? Sometimes kids will say, yeah, I still don't understand, if they had an understanding of, the cat having cancer or, a grandparent having cancer, there might be some misconceptions connected to that or how that relates to the specific situation in the family. And I think it's also important that we're encouraging young people to ask questions and share their worries, reassuring that no matter what they say, it's all okay, and that you yourself are going to admit that you don't have all the answers. My work with young people, I think they feel tremendous relief in hearing from an adult in their life that I don't know everything, but I will tell you if I don't know everything, and I will do my best to find those answers when you do have a really hard or a tricky question that I don't have the answer to. So I'm also saying that I'm not going to lie to you. I'm not going to make up an answer just to satisfy your curiosity, but I will tell you if I don't know. Some families like to have like a question jar that lives on their kitchen counter and that people in the family can anonymously, although you're probably pretty good at determining each other's handwriting, ask questions or write worries down, and once a week look through those. Sometimes those questions actually go to medical appointments where you can get some answers to those questions. So that's a nice way to do it too. Okay, so there's some takeaways here. I think when we're talking about the illness, so in this situation, we're talking about cancer, we really want to be specific to talking about the cancer, talking about where in the body the cancer is existing, or where it was first discovered. And talk about the different treatments that have been tried or that are going to be tried, and talking about the evidence that we know exists that shows us that this illness is present. So on the right of the screen, you'll see, and again, a nice example of a visual. I'm going to actually pull away from the presentation for just a moment and bring up the whiteboard to show you what I would do in a session for explaining to a child or walking through the conversation of what does cancer look like. So I first start by talking about, asking, do you know what cells are? And usually kids will have, a pretty good answer of, for some reason, blood cells seem to be something that they've heard about. We talk about, yeah, sure, blood cells. Could you name another part of the body? And cells are really just the building blocks of everything that's alive. So trees are made up of cells, grass are made up of cells, animals, and people. And every single one of those cells has a special program that lives inside. And if they're an older child, I will talk about the nucleus that contains that information for what that job of that cell is supposed to be. And that cell knows exactly what to do and how long to live and when to die. And before it dies, it splits itself into two, and those other cells know exactly how to continue to be that part of the body. So kids might give an example of like eyeballs. Okay, so eyeballs are made up of thousands of cells that know how to be eyeballs. And they're constantly growing and dying and replacing, and they all know how to do the job of being an eyeball. And then we talk about blood cells. Blood cells live in our veins in our body. And that's, again, an opportunity for you to pull out a body book or pull up a resource online where you can look at the circulatory system. And what kind of blood cells are there? We've got red blood cells, and maybe kids want to help you draw, or maybe you use stickers to add these into the vein. And what do the red blood cells do? Well, they carry really important things all throughout our body. Oxygen that we pick up from our lungs and transport to our muscles and our brain, and nutrients in the form of energy that our body needs to stay alive. So that's a really important job of our red blood cells. What other blood cells do we have? We have white blood cells. Okay, so they might help with drawing that or putting stickers on. They might want to choose a color to represent those white blood cells. The white blood cell's job I describe as being like the army in the body, and their job is to defend or protect. And so anytime they notice an intruder, for example, a flu or a cold or bacteria, what do we think those white blood cells are going to do? They're going to kick into overdrive. The body's going to get the message that we need to make more, and they're going to send those to gobble up those intruders. Okay, so that's pretty straightforward. Sometimes those intruders can't go away with the work of our body. So our immune system, our white blood cells need a little bit of help. And that can come in the form of medicine. Medicine, sometimes we have to take a pill or cough medicine, that sort of thing that can help us fight those invaders. Then we'll also talk about, what about cells that don't really have a good job to do? They're a little bit mixed up, and they grow in the place of healthy cells, and they don't really do the job that that part of the body does. Those are called cancer cells. So those are cells that grow often pretty quickly. Sometimes they grow all together, and they start taking the place of the healthy cells in our body. What do we think our body is going to do in response to that? Most of the time, kids put it together pretty quickly, and they'll say, oh, they're going to send our intruders, or our army to gobble up those intruders. And that is absolutely true. Our white blood cells do try to respond when we notice that we've got cancer cells that are taking the place of our healthy cells. The tricky thing about cancer cells, though, is that they often look quite similar to the healthy cells, and they don't do the job that those cells do. And so it can be kind of hard for our body to be able to fight them on their own. And this is when I would be talking about some of the different treatments. So chemotherapy, I'll ask kids, do you know what that is? Have you heard of that? It's a special type of medicine that tries to kill fast-growing cells. But it also can kill some of the fast-growing cells, like our white blood cells. And so for that reason, when somebody's taking chemotherapy, we need to be extra careful that we're not giving them things like viruses, colds, or flus. We also need to make sure that we're getting more sleep, because it's pretty tiring when a lot of our cells are being wiped out by the chemotherapy. And that can include hair cells as well, which is why some people experience hair loss when they're on chemotherapy. Another form of treatment is radiation, which I describe as light waves that can try to blast apart those cancer cells and stop them from growing as quickly as they want to. Sometimes that cancer is just too strong and it will keep growing or will grow in new places. Another option that we have for treating cancer is surgery. And surgery is simply where we try to remove those cancer cells from the body. And sometimes there's parts of the body that are eligible for removal, and sometimes that isn't an option. Okay. So in a nutshell, that's a really kind of brief and quick overview of how I might introduce that conversation to kids. Sorry, I want to make sure that I'm sharing my screen again. Okay, bear with me. I have to zip back through where we've got to so far. Yes, okay. So the thing that I'm carrying in the back of my mind as I'm working through this conversation about cancer, and as I'm moving forward, are what I call the 5 C's. One being, did I cause it? Again, kids being egocentric, wanting to know that they weren't the reason that this has happened. There are very few types of cancer that we know exactly why they have been caused. 2 that we might talk about would be skin cancer as a result of sun exposure, and lung cancer as a result of chemicals inhaled, whether through smoking or through other environmental factors or workplace related factors. But even at that, we know that not everybody who gets who has prolonged sun exposure develops cancer, or and not everybody who smokes develops a lung cancer. And same to be true that not everybody who has cancer has smoked or has sun exposure. So there's a whole bunch that we actually don't know. And it really is the billion-dollar industry of trying to determine the answer to that question. So I'll normalize that for kids, that we really don't know. But what we do know is that kids are not the reason that people develop cancer. No amount of stressing out your parent is the reason that they have developed cancer. And nothing that they have done intentionally has created cancer in their body. Can I catch it? So again, when we've been talking about it as being sick, or we need to be careful around them that we're not, or we need to be careful around somebody with cancer that we're not passing on bacteria or viruses because of their treatments, isn't the same thing as being contagious. So we can still hug and kiss and cuddle the person, and we're not going to catch cancer. Okay, it's not a contagious illness. Can I cure it? Again, kids trying to take on the responsibility of the world, feeling like this is something that is up to them to be able to make go away. We need to reassure them that this is not something that is their responsibility to make better or make go away. Who is going to take care of me? This is really important too, whether that's in the interim of, knowing that daddy isn't going to be able to pick you up from school or take you to soccer practice, that you do have other people in mind who are willing to step up and help. But also in the bigger picture, that there is that fear that, and what if, this treatment isn't successful? And what if the cancer makes your body stop working? Or what if you die? Knowing that there are people in their life who will continue to take care of them can provide a good amount of reassurance that you don't have to have that conversation again, that they know that there's a plan in place and they don't need to worry about it. And also really important that as things continue to progress, that there will be new information communicated to them in the way that they have chosen. So do they want to know on a weekly basis? Do they want to know only the big stuff? Do they want to know as soon as you know? Or do you want to have, a family meeting once a week? Those are some options for how to keep the communication moving. And as I've mentioned already, making sure that you're inviting questions don't have all the answers. As I was saying before, I think it's really reassuring for young people. We don't have all the answers, but I will try my best to find out those answers if you have them, or if you have for those questions that you have that maybe I don't have the answers to. And some suggestions for ways that you can provide options for young people to be with somebody while they're unwell. They can decorate their room. They might choose some music. They might come and read at the bedside. They might choose to decorate blankets and pillowcases, help with some things like mouth care and moisturization, simply coming in and watching a movie together, and do your homework with the bedside, doing nail polish. And the picture below is one of my favorite activities. It's called a hug. So you just take a strip of fabric, an old bed sheet, a bottom of a t-shirt, and permanent markers, and they can decorate, trace their hands. And it's a lovely object for kids to leave with their person, so that they know that even though mommy isn't able to come and participate in some of our family activities or things out of the house at this moment, we know that she's still getting the messages that we love her and we care about her, and she's getting the rest that she needs, that sort of thing. So again, our job maybe isn't about so much fixing the problem or fixing the worries that kids are going to inevitably bring forward to us. But our job is to just bear witness, and that just means listening and creating a non-judgmental space for them to have a whole range of reactions to something that is incredibly difficult. So again, the takeaways are just a high-level overview of some of the things that we've talked about here. Is that it's important to be honest, using simple but accurate language, include them in the conversations, include them even if it's feeling really difficult, making sure they have a safe environment that they can ask questions and share their worries, and know that it's okay not to have all those answers, and that our job can be to wonder with them, and that feels a whole lot better for young people than feeling like they have to wonder about these things alone. So I'm just going to wrap up with some of the resources that I always have on hand to share with families. Kidsgrief.ca is a wonderful resource that's been developed through Canadian Virtual Hospice. Once a month, they do a live question and answer with an Ask the Expert. They also have, you can write in any time with your questions that you have specifically anonymously, sharing some details, and it will be answered and posted online. They've got a great archive of other people who have asked questions too, looking for guidance around this topic. And here's a list of a couple of really great resources that you can look through before you might have these conversations. Canadian Cancer Society has developed a tip sheet. Kids Health, I love this website for explaining any illness. I've yet to come across an illness that I haven't been able to find on Kids Health that I've needed some support to be able to explain to kids. CAPO is the Canadian Association for Psychosocial Oncology. They've got some great recommendations for getting these conversations started with kids. And tellingkidsaboutcancer.com is, again, a great resource for guiding these conversations as well. This is very pertinent for teenagers. cancerreallysucks.org is the resource, and it's very youth friendly. Another resource developed by the organization I was mentioning before, Winston's Wish out of the UK, specifically for teenagers as well. And a couple of books here for those that want a bit more information. Living Dying is available through the Dr. J Children's Grief Center for a $10 donation to the center. They'll send you either the PDF version or a hard copy in the mail. Jonah Hamilton's When a Parent is Sick, helping parents explain serious illness to children. It's not new, but her principles are all very relevant and very helpful. And another resource developed by Winston's Wish, As Big as It Gets, is also a really great resource to have. Great resource for kids to have. You might want to follow up the conversation by saying, maybe it doesn't feel so safe to talk to me, but you can call Kids Health anytime. And their staff and their volunteers are all trained in how to respond to these kinds of situations as well. So I'm going to bring it back to Vinitha to see if we had any questions that popped up throughout the presentation. We promised that we would leave some time at the end here. So I'm open to, if you have more specific questions that would be helpful for us to talk through, or even just any comments on some of the things that we've talked about today.
So thank you so much, Colleen, for that presentation. It was so detailed and you covered so many topics I know people will find very helpful. So I just wanted to thank you for that lovely presentation. And now I think we'll go on to the question. So if you do have any questions at this point too, feel free to just type them in to the Q&A button and we'll try to get to them. We do have a couple of minutes left. But I guess for now, one question that I would have for you, Colleen, is if you had to, for someone walking away from this presentation, if you had to summarize, say 3 key points that you would hope that either parents or educators bring to their children when this topic does come on the table, what 3 takeaways would you have?
Yeah, good question, and I'm glad you've asked it. I think operating with honesty as your policy, I think most families that I meet, that seems to be in the fabric of the values that they carry in their family, is that they want to be honest. But then this is incredibly challenging, and that, for some of the reasons that we talked about at the start of the presentation, they kind of get in the way. So when you come back to that value as saying, it's the foundation for lifelong trusting relationships, reassuring yourself that children can handle what we think they can't, as long as we're able to say that, I'm being honest with you. They really value that. I've never met a child who regrets knowing this hard information, but I have met children who regret that they weren't included sooner and that they weren't given the information at the time that everybody else in the family knew. So I'd say honesty and moving you through the conversation in whatever style you choose to is important. I would go back to that slide where we talk about the 5 C's, get familiar with that and know and have that operating in the back of your mind as you're navigating these conversations, is a really great tool just for navigating as you hear questions from kids, as you hear yourself talking about these things. That is a really great option for helping you to support the conversation. And then again, it's okay that you don't have all the answers. I think that is the reality of living with a cancer diagnosis. From the moment that there's a diagnosis in place, there's a great deal of uncertainty. And so it's only human, I think it's only natural that we're going to have a reaction when it comes to including young people as feeling like, well, I now need to be an expert, but I'm really unsure about a lot of these things too. And that is completely normal and completely okay.
Mm-hmm. So thank you so much for that, for summarizing like the key highlights. I think those are very, very important points that you touched on. So I'm just looking at the questions. So it doesn't look like we have any more questions for now. So I think with that, we'll wrap up. And I just wanted to say thank you again, Colleen, for such an amazing presentation, and for everyone who was able to join us today. And if you do know anyone who would find this webinar to be beneficial, or you would want to recheck it out yourself, it should be uploaded to our Well on the Web website under self-paced webinars in hopefully about 2 weeks or less. So feel free to just take a look at that at a later moment if you need to as well. So with that being said, I just wanted to say thank you again to everyone and wish everyone a great rest of your day, rest of your week, and for everyone to take care of themselves during this time. So thank you very much.
Thank you.